joined now by someone who is responsible for what I think is the most visually interesting Dalek story of the classic series, which was, of course, Revelation of the Daleks. I would like to introduce production designer Alan Spalding. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Nice to meet you.
I suppose in these rather odd times, talking about Doctor Who from the 80s wasn't the first thing you thought you'd be talking about.
No, true.
But if I mention the show, was it a happy experience?
It was. Yes. It was very. I was very happy with it, the look of it, and the way it went, and so it was. I was quite very pleased with it. It was. I think it was only 2 episodes, but I think there were 2 60-minute episodes. Because we had a lot of interesting things. We had a sort of embryonic Dalek and several levels within the series, and I think that was very much the Doctor Who genre at the time, where you had a lot of intertwining plot lines.
And as a designer, that seemed to give you a great scope for such a contrast of the darker catacombs and the brighter sort of surface level. Was that quite a nice challenge?
It was, yes. I mean, it was sort of implicit in the script that this planet had been a death planet for thousands of years. So the idea that it had kind of layers and layer upon layer upon layer, and the top layer was very modern, and we shot it down at the IBM building, in I think it was near Portsmouth, which at the time was a really hyper-modern building, and we put sort of statues on the approaches to the building, and then the interiors were all studio, and then the catacombs underneath again were all studio sets.
And once you've designed a studio set, are you then involved on the day with how it's lit? Because I think partly it's design, but also partly the sort of low level of lighting. Was that your input?
Well, it's in discussion with the lighting, yes. I mean, at the time, the BBC was very into the kind of idea of a realization team, where minds came together, the cameras, lighting, design, director, obviously, who coordinate it all. But it was a realization team, which worked very well at the time.
And of course, as well as designing the sets, the Daleks had a new paint scheme. Was that something you were involved with, or did that come from the producer?
The Daleks were always the kind of BBC special effects did, or visual effects as they were called at the time. So they always were responsible for making them. Again, that was my input into because one of them had to be embryonic, so we decided to create an acrylic Dalek, which was quite stunning. Actually, you took the lights beautifully.
Because yes, of all the sort of classic Daleks, I always think of that glass embryonic one as fantastically eerie and sort of takes it back to what a Dalek is. That must have been an interesting design process.
Yeah. I mean, there's always a problem with Dalek. This week they started to fly, I think, because that sort of got over the problem of the fact that they couldn't go upstairs. So the Daleks started to be able to fly.
And the story includes a lot of model shots as well. Obviously, you're across design for the whole thing, but does that become almost a sort of separate entity that you might give ideas or a concept, or are you across that in the same way you are as studio?
I'd like to think, as a production designer, you're across the whole look of the whole project, that you visually coordinate all of it. So whether it's a location or a studio set, or whether it's a model, then it's all part of the design. Because if somebody has to keep their visual eye across it, otherwise it goes off at a tangent.
And the director of that story was Graeme Harper, who many that worked with him sort of pick him out as a particularly good director. What were your experiences working with him?
Well, I'd worked with him before on Juliet Bravo, and we got on very well. There was a good sort of meeting of minds, and he was incredibly enthusiastic about the whole sort of thing, and he's actually very good to work with, and and very receptive to what you've got to offer. So if you build a big set, he'll shoot it as a big set, which for designers is always quite complimentary.
But of course, another series you did with the BBC, which was less studio bound, was the Chronicles of Narnia, which sort of went a lot into location work. How was that as a sort of totally different genre or medium to work in?
Well, it started, there was actually 3 series. The first series was mostly studio, mostly shot in multi-camera studio with some locations. The second and third series were almost entirely shot on location, unless you absolutely had to come to the studio, because we couldn't build an underground city there was no such thing. And we had giants, so we had to build giant sets. But very much driven by the idea that it was location, style was locations, and studio as and when. There's always a slight problem with children's hours. It's much easier to schedule them into a studio than it is to schedule them on location because of needing tutors and things, shooting them during the summer holidays.
That was very much, I'm thinking, a children's, that was under the children's department. So
Yeah.
How did that affect you? Did you have any sort of more limitations, or was budget more of an issue?
The opposites, actually. I mean, it was designed for the family show, so it was sort of Sunday tea time. But it did have co-production money. The design budget was huge, probably the biggest I've had for a lot of years. It was a lot of money because we built the Dawn Treader completely and took it to sea. Wasn't cheap.
And if you were approaching the series today, would you approach it from a very different perspective, or sort of much the same?
Well, it's hard to say. I think probably much the same, because I was very much the style was kind of working from pre-Raphaelite and those sort of early 20th century children's book illustrators like Rackham and Charles Robinson and whatever. So, and it worked so well as a kind of style guide that it would be quite hard not to do, because my feeling with the movies, they were very kind of Disney driven, and they lost the kind of quality that the books have. But then I would say that wouldn't being biased.
But were the books, were they sort of a genre that interested you?
Yes. Again, the books are very. They don't give a lot away. They're quite hard because Lewis sort of puts a bit of everything in there. He's got Greek myths, he's got Nordic myths, he's got medieval history, he's got Arthurian legend, and he sort of puts it all into a big pot. Which is why, going back to the Pre-Raphaelites and those early book illustrators, they were illustrating all of the things that are in the books. So that's why it was a good kind of style reference.
Because you've done a lot of work across various periods. So is something like fantasy, did it give a sort of a better sense of realism by grounding it in some sort of historical period or reference?
Well, I think so. I think you've got to, if you don't do that with fantasy, it's very easy for it to kind of go astray. And you start bringing in a lot of sort of kind of genre, sort of He-Man sort of type images which don't have any kind of style to them. So by putting it into a kind of a period, you create a kind of skeleton that you can hang everything onto. As long as you don't get too anal about it and you don't start saying, oh, we can't have this, we can't have that because it's not right for period. Because it doesn't matter as long as the world you create is believable, then you get it'll work.
And that was a world you were part of for more than just 1 year. Was it quite nice to expand what you'd done in the first series as it continued?
Well, it was nearly 4 years. There were 3 series, and we set hoping that we're going to do more series. it was set in a medieval world. So we set the first one in sort of like the 13th century, knowing that we still had another 2 centuries to go, because they go back to Narnia 100 years into the future. So you still could keep a kind of style, even though Narnia had kind of developed over the time.
And then, of course, we talked about Doctor Who, about Chronicles of Narnia. Working at the BBC, you were across all sorts of series, like Juliet Bravo, Crackerjack. Do you have a particular preference for a period or a present day, or what's sort of your favourite?
Well, I think medieval is my favourite period. I've only done one film. I've done a film about Richard the Lionheart, and not. But I've done a lot of historical stuff in recent years. Roman and the thing called Warriors, which was a lot of Roman and one about Napoleon. So it's just kind of history generally, I think, is my kind of preference. History and fantasy.
As a freelancer, you're now able to direct your career in whatever direction you would like, rather than it being, this is a series we'd like to work on.
Yeah, well, I've been very fortunate being asked to do things that I've enjoyed doing. So, series on ancient Rome at the BBC was 6 films about 6 different characters, and then another thing called Warriors, which is about 6 warriors throughout history. So those sort of 6 films takes a long time. It's more than a year's work. So no, I've been happy to. I did a thing about the space race, which I was very pleased about, but wasn't naturally my thing. I'm not, wouldn't. And yet I found it quite fascinating. But it wouldn't something I would naturally have kind of gone into.
And I believe you started off in theatre. When you transferred to television, did you find you had a sort of different mindset to those that had purely worked in television?
A little bit. A lot of things I've done have been quite theatrical. I mean, because I trained in interior design and then went into theatre design, television sort of falls into the middle. Theatre teaches you about performance and movement of actors and how actors relate to the space. And interior design teaches you about history and period and whatever. So television fell quite well into the middle. The main difference with film and TV is that it's the camera you're designing to and not the eye. So you have to constantly be aware of that. You're not building big sets that nobody's going to see because the camera doesn't look at them. So it's a much more collaborative process, as I was saying earlier, about discussing what it is you're trying to see, discussing what it is required.
On that note, and I think it's worth saying to viewers, you have a website which demonstrates some of your work. It's certainly worth looking at. I'd just like to say thank you very much for your time, Alan. It's been a real pleasure.
Okay, take care. Okay, bye-bye.